All right, our next presenter is going to be Scott McBain, who's a fluvial geomorphologist at McBain Associates, Applied River Sciences. He's been a consultant for the Hoopa Valley Tribal Fisheries Department since 1989. He was one of many authors of the Trinity River Flow Evaluation Study with his focus on the high flow and sediment management components. His discussion will focus on the evolution of the coarse sediment management strategy described in the flow study and the 2000 ROD, and potential future coarse sediment management strategy considerations. So, Scott.
Dave, how do I work this? Red button? Okay. All right, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me here. I've been working on the Trinity since 1989. I'm almost the Pleistocene. And I have a lot of different authors that contributed to this, and I also wanted to bring in some of the great information that Todd has collected recently. But James asked me to kind of give a little bit of a background on the old history of how we kind of came up with this, because sometimes it's forgotten since this was really developed in the 1990s, particularly the flow and the sediment interaction back in the day. Some of the things that we got right, some of the things that we got wrong. And then kind of considerations of coarse sediment management targets. So thinking of a potential better target than what we currently are using. And then using that target, looking at results of what we've seen from 2014 to 2023, looking at some of the data that Todd's collected last year, and then thinking about future coarse sediment management objectives. So back in the old days, kind of the foundation of a lot of this work was the 1997 maintenance flow study prepared by Hoopa tribe that looked at the flows, the sediment, riparian vegetation, recession limbs, and then that was integrated with some of the fisheries data that Fish and Wildlife was collecting to form the basis of the flow evaluation study. And then in 2007, first of all, the flow evaluation study was very broad in prescriptions on sediment management. It had a few specific recommendations, but then it had very broad goals and objectives that weren't really necessarily quantified. And then the 2007 coarse sediment management plans tried to take kind of the next steps of identifying source areas, identifying potential locations in more specificity, refining some of the conceptual models. And then there's been more recent work as well. But that's kind of where we kind of got to where, kind of the foundational documents from back in the day. So the next few slides, I'll just talk about that historical context and conceptual models for sediment, for coarse sediment components. So Lewiston Dam, North Fork, you've seen this a million times. If we look at kind of that simple sediment budget conceptual model, we had no sediment supply coming in downstream of Lewiston Reservoir, and then the tributaries cumulatively would contribute sediment, both coarse and fine sediment, some more than others, as Todd mentioned. Rush Creek is the first major tributary, but in the absence, or not absence, but in the severe restriction of high flows, most of that coarse sediment would grade as deltas, forming a huge backwater that was a mile long below Rush Creek. And so we have these deltas as we go down. And then when we get down to Indian Creek, it's kind of an alluvial transition where the cumulative effects of increasing hydrology and increasing sediment supply from unregulated watersheds from Indian, Weaver, Reading Creek, and Browns Creek kind of transformed the river channel. So when I started my work back in 1989, we were looking for study sites for alluvial features, and we floated this whole 40 miles, and there was like a handful of exposed gravel bars, most of which were at deltas, but the riparian encroachment was so bad, and the sand-bedded channel, as Todd mentioned, was so bad, there was very few gravel bars, so it made doing our work pretty difficult in finding those spots. So when we looked at sediment, we certainly looked at trying to reintroduce variability in the hydrology that was tied to sediment management. So one is the interannual variability. This is just a summary of annual runoffs from 1912 to 1992, unimpaired computations post-dam. And it shows the variability around an average of about 1.2 million acre feet, so wetter and drier years. And then the post-dam minimum releases at 120,000 acre feet up to 340,000 in the late 80s and early 90s. But really, it's the approach of that wetter years do more geomorphic work. And using that prior conceptual model for sediment, below Lewiston Dam, where there is no sediment supply, it would require more coarse sediment augmentation to compensate for higher flows, higher magnitude flows, and potentially longer duration flows. And so we assigned different coarse sediment augmentations for each of those water year types. In the driest years, it was 0 gravel augmentation just because flows are too low to really move sediment. And in the wettest years, had some very, very large volumes, up to 31 to 67,000 cubic yards of sediment. So very high numbers. We were idealistic at the time, thinking that we could do gravel management or coarse sediment management on a year-specific basis to match the hydrology. But as the TRP quickly realized that planning and the logistical nightmare of not knowing what water year type you are, and then not knowing whether you're going to do 0 cubic yards or 30,000 cubic yards, it really wasn't very workable. And so we've shifted to kind of a more steady gravel augmentation approach. So going to the next level of detail for variables, variable hydrology, the interannual, we've seen this quite a few times, but we kind of have to think about how sediment transport related to the natural hydrograph here, not just fish or black cottonwood, but and thinking about elevations within the watershed and the tributaries within the watershed and how they deliver sediment. So the Trinity would get these, winter storms, fall freshets, winter storms, rain on snow events, and then the snowmelt hydrograph. One of the things that we quickly realized is the location of the dam at the elevation of the dam. The dam basically eliminated the snowmelt hydrograph from the watershed, but tributaries downstream of the dam, lower elevation, didn't have much of a snowmelt hydrograph, but they had a lot of rainfall and rain on snow events. And so with the water that we had available and the mandates by Department of Interior solicitors in trying to make the most use of the water that we were looking for, we put our eggs into restoring the snowmelt basket so that these hydrographs would accomplish our geomorphic objectives, riparian objectives, smolt-out migration, footy-legged frog reproduction on dry years, et cetera. So that was kind of the approach that we took. But then we're always asked, well, you idiots, what about the winter flows? That's where all that variability was. And so the way that we looked at this, again, with kind of a water budget perspective, is that we looked at downstream tributaries is to provide that variability because they are lower elevation. So here's just a conceptual, or it's not a conceptual, but an example from a 1951 year where we had the Douglas City gauge. It's about 24 miles downstream, and that's the red line here. So this is an unimpaired hydrograph. Because we also had the Lewiston gauge, we could subtract those two to get accretion between Lewiston and Douglas City. So then what we did is we took a wet water year here, see the flat line through the winter, and then the spring snowmelt hydrograph. So that's the Lewiston release in green. And then we'd overlay that tributary accretion with respect to some of the geomorphic thresholds that we identified in the maintenance flow study and the flow study that we were trying to achieve downstream. And you can see with the blue line here is kind of the simulated or calculated hydrograph about 24 miles downstream at Douglas City. And the tributaries are getting over some of these geomorphic thresholds. So it's mobilizing bars sometimes and pool tails. So it can do some work, but one of the main things, though, is that right below the dam, obviously those tributaries don't exist. This is a cumulative effect of those tributary flows. So this adds a lot of variability 20 miles downstream, but from mile 0 to 20 downstream of the dam, it does much, much less. So that was one of the trade-offs that we made back in the day. So the very broad coarse sediment management goals, where we wanted to increase coarse sediment storage within the bankful channel, because a lot of that we just didn't see any in the late 80s and early 90s, and then maintain that storage with a balanced coarse sediment budget in the different reaches. So looking at the multiple sediment budgets, so that included gravel augmentation below Lewiston Dam, but also transporting those coarse sediments delivered by the tributaries. So we made the most use of that free gravel that the tributaries were delivering. Again, with our spring release, a lot of the delivery from the tributaries were out of phase from when we were moving them, unless we got some of those, higher tributary floods where it could start moving some of the delta materials. So there's some other objectives, including, we want to stop the aggradation at the deltas, get full sediment routing through all the different reaches, not have sediment traps. But the main thing was to target the overall goal of to create the scale down alluvial river that is scaled to the post-rod flow regime. And so to do that, the channel needs to be able to adjust its dimensions to create those dynamic aquatic habitats that we were after. But again, when we develop these broad aspirational goals, we talk about increasing coarse sediment and maintaining coarse sediment storage, but none of those foundational studies really defined what storage meant. And so we've never had an objective for that. So that kind of gets us to transitioning to how can we potentially look at a better metric for this that gets at storage? So when you think about storage, storage is, say, area times depth. So real storage to get like cubic yards requires a depth, but how do you measure depth of, say, gravel in the river? Depth is really hard to measure, and certainly what's a post record decision depth. And so trying to associate storage with a volume, we kind of abandoned that, and we're thinking about a different approach where we use an index of storage that better relates to physical processes and habitat objectives. And so we're considering using active bar area as that metric, with the underlying assumption that more bar area per length of the Trinity River to up to some degree till we get to, well below a braided type of system that indicates more gravel storage in the system, more alluvial features available as habitat and channel form. So what is active bar area? How is it measured? So we measure by defining the lower boundary by the 450 CFS water surface in the summer. So we have consistency across the years. The upper boundary is a little bit harder because it requires some interpretation. And so the picture kind of shows how that would be defined in an easier situation. It's the edge of vegetation, the edge of the exposed gravel bars, imbrication of gravels indicating recent movement by the by the current rod regime, transition of gravels to sands to vegetation, and the edge of that kind of the scaled down gravel that's occurring as part of the post-rod flow regime. So we did this analysis first in 2014. We had one of our interns from the Czech Republic came down and mapped this whole thing with us. And we divided into different subreaches, 9 different subreaches. So Rush Creek backwater is 2. So 1 is from Lewiston Dam down to there. 3 is down to Grass Valley Creek. 4 is down to Indian Creek. 5 is in the Browns Canyon. Or actually 5 is the Indian Creek Delta. 6 is down to here. 7 is down to Dutch Creek, etc. as you go down. And so the 2014 results, this kind of shows the longitudinal perspective, individual mapped patches and distance downstream from Lewiston Dam. And so the blue lines are individual patches, so you can see some of the bigger patches, and then the horizontal lines for each of the subreaches shows the average active bar area for each of those reaches. And the metric that we're using over here is square meters per 1,000 meter channel length. So it's kind of like a density of active bar area. So it kind of gives you an idea of like where there's active bar area per length of channel. And so we can see higher volumes up closer to the dam, probably largely in respect to the gravel augmentation that Dave talked about. That's where most of it occurred. Virtually none in the Rush Creek backwater because it's a backwater. And then from Rush Creek downstream, higher values. And this is so Loudon Meadows is in here. And so a lot of gravel augmentation occurred in here. And then we see a big transition here below Grass Valley Creek down to Indian Creek, where it's much, much lower. We really haven't done any gravel augmentation in this reach, or very little. There's a couple rehab projects in there. Less accessible, a lot of private land. It's much harder to get in here. So this is kind of a notable anomaly. And then you have the Indian Creek Delta that's much higher. And then in that alluvial transition, it's higher than in the Grass Valley Creek range, but still fairly low until we get down below Oregon Gulch, and then it really opens up. And I have a reason for that. But anyways, it just kind of gives us an idea of what that active bar area might look like. So you get these densities, and it's like, what does this look like in the field? So maybe we can start at the lower end in subreach 4. This is at Poker Bar, and it just kind of has some examples of like, okay, here's 0. Obviously, there's no active bars. This one is 600 cubic meters per 1,000 meter density, and it's just this little point bar right here. So really not much, and then 0 down in here. So it's kind of in that starved reach. This is down in Browns Canyon. This is like one of the higher ones at 5,000 cubic meters per 1,000 meters. And so you can see bars popping up here outlined in yellow. This is 2,500. So even some of these numbers here, it shows bars, but they're not like huge. It's not like oversupplied there. All right, so then you may go, well, how do we start developing some targets here? And that's kind of where we've been stuck since 2014. So we had a team of folks internally that went through the different reaches, looked at valley confinement and space and slope and bedrock obstructions, tributary locations, what we thought was reasonable, like in a similar reach. So like Browns Canyon is kind of confined and steeper. Is that comparable to reach 4 in between Grass Valley Creek and Indian Creek? And so from that, we developed some initial suggested potential active bar storage targets, kind of a range of targets here. These are totally subject to discussion, but we wanted to throw some numbers out there to get some reaction. So that's kind of where we were in 2014. And then Todd's group redid this exact same effort in 2023. And so this is kind of a cumulative look with the red line being 2014. So you can see the inflections, and then the black line in 2023. So you can see a lot more gravel or active bar area within the river down to the North Fork Trinity River right in here. And that reflects about a 45% increase. So fairly substantial increases over that 10 years. So when we look at this with respect to those 2014 administrative draft preliminary targets, here's some of the numbers from 2014 and the different subreaches and how they've changed from the 2023 effort. So you can see there's been quite a bit of increase through many of these. And if you compare them to those targets or potential targets that we showed before, the 2023 is getting in there. So green is pretty much meeting up with those. Red is at the lower end of those. And then the darker red is still got a little ways to go. So from these reaches, I guess our initial recommendations is reach 4 probably deserves the most attention. It's a lot harder because of accessibility, but there's a lot of potential there for increases, and there's also a lot more potential for fish use up there being closer to the dam. So there's more dense active bar area in reach 6 to 7. So there's more opportunity to increase. And then subreach 8 below Dutch Creek, there's a lot of rehab projects going on. So I expect this number to increase a lot just in response to those rehab projects. But overall, there's been a substantial increase since 2014. So now let's think about how we might be able to use this for TRP management. So if we have some of these targets, if we can refine these targets and get some better input on them, we can identify some key geomorphic reaches to use this metric to inform long-term as well as annual coarse sediment augmentation. So like which sites can we use, where to place it, how much at each site. And it gives us a target like trying to get up to that kind of storage. And then in some places that are less accessible, and particularly given the information that Dave just shared with us, is that we can't expect gravel added at the top of the reach to fully route down throughout the entire reach. So I think that we're going to need to look at multiple locations and look for other mechanisms where we can't haul in gravel trucks to try to make the best use of coarse sediment that's actually already routing through the system. So roughness elements, large wood boulder placements, and other things in some of these places that are less accessible to try to increase storage and residency time of that gravel. So if we're thinking about potential next steps, I was consistent, I think, with Todd's recommendation was to continue to access active bar areas. I think a 5-year time step is a pretty reasonable thing, and this method is pretty easy and inexpensive to do. But I think that we really need to kind of do a critical review of the targets that were developed in 2014, update those with more recent results that you've heard about over the past few days, incorporating some, fry and pre-smolt habitat relationships that were part of our 2023 report that kind of relates active bar area to fry and pre-smolt habitat. Look at the controlling factors again, foot-legged frog breeding habitat and the hyporheic benefits, which we really weren't considering here, but that should be hopefully a factor that could play into this reevaluation as well. So just kind of wrapping up, I think that the active bar area metric, it's a really useful metric for informing the program on coarse sediment augmentation. A couple of the real benefits to me is I like the KISS, keep it simple, stupid. This is really helpful. It's intuitive to managers. It's intuitive to the public. People can see it with aerial photography, with ground photos to look at what these densities are. It's inexpensive and repeatable. And it has linkages to many of the program objectives that I just showed here. So I really hope that we can kind of dig into this, at least with the physical work group, and hopefully get some peer review and science advisory board input on this. To use these targets, looking at opportunities, constraints, access, the reality of doing coarse sediment augmentation, and use that to update, refine a long-term coarse sediment management plan, or maybe just turn it into a sediment management plan and incorporate fines into that too. So anyways, I think that's it. Any questions?
Hey, thanks, Scott. Do you guys have a sense, and maybe this is a question for Todd as well, with the increase in active bar area, do you know what you can attribute that to? Is it flows? Is it recently disturbed areas where you did rehabilitation that got things moving?
No, that's a great question. And Todd and I just kind of exchanged this information in the past few weeks. So I think this is the start of that. And so I'd love to sit down and just kind of go into the details and kind of correlate cause and effect as much as we can to look at that. So yeah, I think that'd be just a next step. All right, thank you.